The sun was sinking behind the jagged hills, casting long shadows across the dusty road. The wind carried the faint smell of sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. Along that lonely stretch, a woman rode briskly, her worn cloak flapping against her knees. She guided her 2 daughters with a steady hand, keeping them close as the road twisted through the rugged canyon. Her name was Leora, a widow hardened by years of struggle, yet her eyes held a flicker of warmth that no hardship could dim. Her daughters, young but quick-witted, clung to the rhythm of her horse, their small faces set in quiet determination. Life had forced them to be cautious, to trust only those they had to. And even then, cautiously, the world they lived in was one where danger could ride in on the wind or come from a shadowed bend in the path. Bandits and wanderers alike roamed the territory, and the stories whispered around campfires painted fear into the hearts of those who dared to travel alone. Yet Leora had learned to navigate the unforgiving land with a careful balance of vigilance and courage. That evening, though, something unusual stirred in the silence. A groan, low and desperate, drifted from the side of the road. Leora's hand instinctively went to the reins, slowing her horse as her eyes scanned the rocky embankment. There, half hidden beneath a scraggly juniper bush, was a man, his clothes torn and blood staining his chest. The sight made Leora's heart skip, but it was not fear that gripped her. Compassion, sharper and more urgent than caution, pushed her forward. She dismounted, keeping her daughters behind her, and knelt beside him. "Are you hurt bad?" she asked, her voice steady, though adrenaline thrummed through her veins. The man's eyes opened, dark and wary, as if measuring every movement she made. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and he tried to push her away. But the pain in his body was evident. Leora worked quickly, tearing a strip of cloth from her cloak to bind his wound. "You'll be all right," she said, not certain if it was true, but determined to try. Her daughters peeked from behind her, wide-eyed yet curious, sensing the gravity of the moment without understanding it fully. There was something about this stranger, something more than just a man in need. The air seemed to shift around him, the way the wind settled unnaturally, as if waiting. The man finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, and cautious. "You should not have come," he said, his tone edged with something dangerous. A warning that made Leora freeze for the briefest moment. But the resolve in her heart would not let her turn away. "And you should not lie here alone," she countered softly, meeting his gaze with unwavering eyes. It was then, as she helped him to a sitting position, that she noticed the mark scars etched deep across his forearms, patterns that spoke of a life forged in hardship and conflict. His fingers flexed instinctively, alert and precise, a subtle promise of power restrained only by his exhaustion. Leora's mind raced, but she did not retreat. She had faced storms, harsh winters, and men who would take more than they gave. Yet there was a strength in her that demanded she helped as she guided him to her wagon. The girls whispering questions and curiosity that she shushed gently. She felt the presence of the unknown pressing against her, a tension that made the canyon seem smaller, tighter, more alive. The man leaned heavily against her, every step a testament to resilience. Yet the shadow in his eyes told a story she could not yet read. He remained silent, but each glance he cast over his shoulder suggested awareness of dangers unseen, and perhaps of enemies that were closing in. Night fell quickly, the sky darkening into a velvet blackness pierced only by stars. Leora's small cabin, just beyond a grove of twisted oaks, became their refuge for the evening. She set him on the old quilted mattress, tending to his wounds as best she could, all the while sensing that this man carried more than injuries. There was a weight in the way he held himself, a tension that suggested he had walked paths most feared to even imagine. Her daughters hovered nearby, frightened yet mesmerized by the silent figure who seemed both vulnerable and commanding at once. "Why are you here?" Leora asked finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. The man's eyes met hers, dark pools reflecting candlelight, and in that gaze she saw a storm. "Because I had no choice," he replied finally, each word measured, deliberate. "Because the road chose me and you." He faltered slightly, the first hint of humility, or perhaps caution. You chose to act when most would not. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. Leora sensed that the night carried a secret and that she had stepped unwittingly into a story far larger than her own. She did not yet know the name of the man she had saved, nor the shadowed reputation that trailed him across the plains. Yet instinct told her that the life she had carved out with care and toil was about to intersect with a destiny wild and dangerous, one that would test every ounce of her courage. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faintest echoes of hoofbeats and distant voices. Danger was near, though unseen, and Leora could feel it pressing against the edges of the cabin walls. The man she had saved shifted on the mattress, groaning softly, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability softened the edge of his intensity. She wondered who he truly was, and what storms followed in his wake. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that the night would not pass quietly, that tomorrow could bring revelations neither she nor her daughters were ready to face. And as the firelight danced across his scarred features, Leora felt a chill, the kind that reaches into the bones and warns of paths that can never be undone. She did not yet know that the man in her cabin was the most feared Apache in the territory, a name that even the boldest ranchers and soldiers spoke only in hushed tones. She only knew that she had acted when her heart demanded it, and now the consequences of that choice were beginning to stir. Somewhere beyond the hills, a presence watched, calculating and patient. Waiting for the moment to step into their lives, Leora closed her eyes briefly. Inhaling the scent of sage and wood smoke, her mind racing with questions she could not yet answer. Tomorrow would come, and with it, challenges and truths that could not be avoided. Yet in that quiet, suspended moment, there was a fragile bond forming between the widow, her daughters, and the man they had rescued, one that held the promise of survival, danger, and a story that would ripple across the land. Outside, the night deepened, hiding secrets and stirring shadows, leaving a sense of unease and anticipation that would not be resolved until the morning light. The night stretched on, heavy and silent, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Leora sat beside the wounded man, her hands resting lightly on his arm as if the touch alone could anchor him to safety. She had never been afraid of hardship, never shied from work that tested her. Yet the presence of this stranger stirred something different, something that felt like the quiet before a storm. Her daughters slept nearby, their small chests rising and falling, and she found herself glancing at them often, silently promising to protect them, no matter what came. The man's eyes fluttered open again, catching the firelight. They were sharp, dark, and alert, betraying none of the weakness his injuries suggested. "You have a strong hand," he said quietly, his voice rough but not unkind. Leora met his gaze evenly. "It has to be," she replied. "Strength isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about keeping those who matter alive." He nodded slowly, a flicker of respect passing through his eyes, but he said nothing more. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent agreement that words could not yet capture. Hours passed, and the wind outside rose, rustling the oaks and carrying distant sounds from the plains beyond. Leora could hear the faint hoofbeats of a lone rider, or perhaps a wandering horse, and she felt the tension tightening in her chest. She knew that the roads were not empty, that eyes could be watching from the hills or the brush, waiting for a mistake. The man, sensing her unease, shifted slightly on the mattress, his gaze flicking toward the window. "You worry too much," he said softly, though the edge in his voice suggested it was more observation than reassurance. "Do you know this land well?" she asked, curiosity breaking through her caution. He hesitated before replying. "I know it too well," he said finally, his voice low. "Too well, perhaps. And it knows me in ways most would not want." Leora's mind raced. There was something in his words that hinted at danger beyond the simple hardships of traveler history that carried weight, and perhaps enemies she could not imagine. Yet the man's presence also stirred something else, a quiet fascination. He was more than a traveler or a fighter. He was a force that had been shaped by the land, by survival, and by the choices he had made. Leora thought about her daughters. Their small hands and trusting eyes, and a sense of urgency pressed upon her. Whatever his past, whatever the dangers that trailed him, she had made a choice to help him. And now that choice would ripple beyond the quiet of her cabin. She glanced at her youngest, who stirred in her sleep and whispered softly, promising herself that she would protect them from the world outside, no matter how wild or fierce it became. The man's injuries made it clear that he had been in a fight or several. His clothes were torn, dirt-streaked, and stained with dried blood. But more than that, there was a precision to the wounds, a pattern that spoke of skill and intention rather than random violence. Leora had seen men beaten or hunted before, but there was something in the angles of his scars, the way his muscles had adapted to pain, that suggested a life spent on the edge. She realized that the man before her was someone whose reputation, though unknown to her, carried weight far beyond this small cabin. Hours later, when the moon had risen high, silver and sharp in the sky, the man spoke again. "There are men who would follow me," he said, his voice almost a whisper, yet heavy with warning. Leora's pulse quickened. "Men who would kill you?" she asked, keeping her tone calm though her heart raced. He nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "They do not forgive. They do not forget. And they know I have found refuge here." Leora's hands tightened on her knees. She had always known the land could be unforgiving, but the reality of it, pressing close to her door, was something entirely different. Her daughters shifted in sleep again, and Leora's gaze softened. She would not let fear rule her actions, not when lives depended on her. "Then we will be careful," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever comes, we survive. That is all we need to do for now." The man's eyes studied her, the first faint hint of a smile flickering before disappearing into shadow. He was a man of few words, but in that moment, a connection formed, a silent agreement that she had stepped into a story larger than herself, and that she had the courage to remain. The fire burned low, throwing shadows across the rough wooden walls. Leora remembered the stories she had grown up with, tales of warriors and bandits, of plains that were alive with both danger and beauty. She thought of the man she had saved and realized that he embodied both the calm before the storm and the storm itself. His presence was a mystery, a puzzle she could not yet solve. And yet she felt an undeniable pull toward understanding him, toward discovering why his life had brought him to her doorstep on this quiet, dangerous night. Outside, the wind carried new sounds, the faint rustle of movement, a whisper of steps on the gravel. Perhaps just an animal, perhaps something else. Leora's senses sharpened. The land she knew so well now seemed different, alive with hidden eyes and unseen watchers. She could feel the weight of history pressing through the shadows, the echoes of past conflicts and rivalries whispering in the rustle of leaves. The man on the mattress shifted again, alert despite his injuries, and she realized that even here, in this fragile moment of safety, danger lingered just beyond reach. He spoke again, voice low and measured. "You have a brave heart," he said, almost as if testing her. "Most would have ridden past, ignored me, or left me to the night." Leora met his gaze, steady. "I do what I must," she said simply. "And what must be done is sometimes not easy. That is how survival works." He nodded slowly, a faint respect in the tilt of his head. Yet his eyes held a storm she could not touch, a history of choices that had made him both feared and respected, a life that had shaped him into something beyond ordinary. The night deepened, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to shift with a life of their own. Leora felt the weight of responsibility, of knowing that she had stepped into a story that could reach far beyond the safety of her home. She thought of the men who might follow, the dangers she could not yet see, and the mysterious figure who lay injured but alert on her mattress. In that moment, she understood that her choice to act, to save a man whose life was entwined with danger, would change everything for herself, for her daughters, and for the man whose secrets pressed against the edges of the Apache. The wind carried a faint sound of movement again, soft, yet deliberate, as though something or someone was passing near the cabin. Leora's heart tightened, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew the night was not yet over, that the dangers lurking beyond her door were patient and cunning. and though the man she had saved remained silent for now, she could feel the weight of his story pressing forward. A life lived on the edge of violence and survival, a past she could not yet fully comprehend. Her daughters stirred once more, and Leora placed a hand over theirs, grounding them in the fragile safety of the cabin. The man shifted again, grimacing at the pain but remaining alert, eyes scanning the shadows as if he could sense threats invisible to her. Leora understood that he carried more than wounds. He carried history, reputation, and the silent weight of a world that respected few but feared many. The night pressed on, heavy with uncertainty, and Leora felt the tension between the safety of her home and the unknown beyond the cabin walls. She did not yet know that the man before her was the most feared Apache in the territory, a warrior whose name struck fear into those who crossed his path. She only knew that she had acted when her heart demanded it, and now the consequences of her choice were beginning to stir. Like shadows moving just beyond the reach of the firelight, the wind whispered through the oaks, carrying secrets of the land and hints of danger, and Leora understood that the morning would not bring answers, only more questions, more tests, and more of the mystery that had arrived at her doorstep. She drew her daughters closer, wrapping the quilt around them and herself, preparing for the long night ahead. The man's presence was a quiet, tense force in the room, and though she did not yet understand him, she felt the pulse of his story intertwining with her own, and as the fire smoldered, casting flickering shadows across the walls, Leora knew that the road outside would not remain empty, that secrets carried by wind and earth would reach her, and that the choices she had made tonight were only the beginning. Tomorrow, and the days after, would bring challenges that would test her courage, her resolve, and the fragile trust forming between her and the man whose life she had saved. In that stillness, suspense hung heavy, and the story she had stepped into waited, patient and unyielding, for the light of day to reveal its first truths. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the hills, painting the canyon in muted shades of gold and gray. Leora stirred, careful not to wake her daughters, whose breaths were shallow and even, still wrapped in the fragile comfort of sleep. Outside, the land seemed quiet, but she knew better. Quiet was never truly safe. The plains and ridges beyond her cabin were alive with hidden eyes and whispered movements, and the wounded man she had saved was a storm she could feel pressing against the edges of the day. He had slept fitfully, shifting against the quilt, his muscles tensed even in rest. Leora watched him, noting the scar that cut across his jawline, the hardened hands that told a lifetime of survival, the eyes that had never known the luxury of innocence. His presence brought unease as much as fascination. She sensed the weight of the world he carried, the lives he had taken or spared, the enemies who would follow him without hesitation. He stirred now, blinking against the morning light, and for the first time in hours, spoke without restraint. "Have you ever known fear?" he asked quietly. "That comes not from men, but from waiting." Leora hesitated. Fear was a companion she knew well, a shadow she had danced with after the death of her husband, after winters that left her and her daughters hungry and cold. But the fear in his voice was different, shaped not by loss, but by the burden of being hunted. "I've felt it," she said softly, "more than once, but waiting. That can break a person." His gaze lingered on her, sharp, studying. "Then you will understand soon enough," he said, turning his eyes toward the window where the wind rustled through the oaks. The morning brought with it chores that could not wait. Leora moved with purpose, preparing food for herself and her daughters, fetching water from the well, all while keeping one eye on the man whose presence had turned her home into a temporary fortress. Her daughters asked questions, their voices hushed, eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. "Mama, who is he?" her eldest asked. Leora paused, searching for an answer that would neither frighten nor mislead. "He is a traveler who needed help," she said simply. "And sometimes the road brings people into our lives for reasons we cannot yet understand." Yet even as she spoke, she knew the truth was more complicated. The man was not merely a traveler. Every gesture, every measured word, every flicker of his dark eyes suggested a life lived on the edge of danger, a life entwined with conflict and survival. his past hidden beneath layers of strength and silence, pressed into the present like the weight of the canyon walls around them. Leora sensed that the quiet safety of her home was an illusion, temporary at best, and that soon forces beyond her understanding would intrude. By midday, he was able to sit more comfortably, leaning against the wall as Leora worked quietly. Washing clothes and tending to the small garden behind the cabin, the girls played nearby, but their laughter was cautious, careful not to disturb the fragile tension that hung in the room. Leora stole glances at the man, noticing small details that spoke volumes, the twitch of a finger when he sensed movement outside, the way his body shifted toward every sound, trained for threat even in calm. She realized that he was not just strong, but disciplined, a presence honed by danger and survival, and that her act of compassion had brought a life of wild reckoning into her home. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the land when a distant cry carried across the plains, sharp and deliberate. Leora froze, her heart tightening. The man's eyes snapped toward the door, dark and unyielding, and he moved with the sudden, fluid precision of someone who had faced death countless times. "They are near," he said quietly, almost to himself, as if speaking aloud might summon the danger closer. Leora's mind raced. Who could be following him, and why? The wind whispered secrets she could not yet understand, carrying hints of a presence that was patient, calculated, and dangerous. She realized that helping him had brought more than a wounded man into her home. It had brought a story that was far from finished. The plains were vast, but for all their openness, danger could approach with silent certainty. And the man beside her, whose name she did not yet know, carried a shadow that would stretch beyond the confines of her cabin, touching her daughters, her life, and the fragile stability she had fought to build. Later, as the sun dipped lower, painting the canyon walls in warm amber, the man finally spoke of fragments of his past. "I was born in the desert," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of memory, "where the wind cuts like a knife and the night hides more than shadows. I learned early that survival comes at a cost, and that enemies never forgive." He paused, glancing at Leora, whose hands rested in her lap. "I did not choose a quiet life. I never could. And now, the choices I made follow me." Leora absorbed his words, sensing the layers of conflict beneath them. There was more than survival at stake. There was history, pride, loyalty, and vengeance, wrapped together in a web that would not unravel easily. She understood that she had become part of it, whether she wished it or not.
Oh.
And that her home was now a crossroads where past and present collided. Her daughters, playing quietly nearby, were unaware of the stakes. But she knew she must shield them, even as she faced the reality pressing against the walls. Evening fell, and with it, a chill that crept through the cabin. The wind carried distant sounds again, faint, deliberate, and unnerving. Leora tightened the quilt around her daughters, her mind working to predict every possibility, every risk. The man beside her moved with quiet attention, listening, sensing, alert. "They are patient," he said, voice low. "They wait for mistakes. And mistakes they find." Leora nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. The threat was real, but unseen, a tension that would not be resolved tonight. Or perhaps tomorrow. She thought of her husband, of the life she had tried to preserve for her daughters, and realized that it had all changed in a single act of compassion. Saving him had drawn a line in the sand, connecting her fate to a story she could not yet control. And though fear pressed at the edges of her resolve, she felt the quiet pulse of determination. Whatever came, she would face it. She would protect her daughters. She would meet the storm. Night deepened, and the shadows outside the cabin thickened, alive with the promise of unseen watchers. The man leaned back, listening to the sounds of the canyon, his face unreadable. Leora caught glimpses of movement shadows between the trees, a shift in the wind that seemed purposeful, deliberate. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. She understood with a sinking certainty that the danger following him was not idle, that the plains carried forces she could not yet see, and that her choices tonight would shape everything to come. Her daughters slept, fragile and unaware. and Leora's gaze lingered on them, before turning to the man whose presence had unsettled and fascinated her from the first moment. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, a question half of curiosity, half of necessity. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his dark eyes reflected the firelight, calm yet sharp, as if weighing the risk of revealing his truth. Finally, he spoke. "I am someone the world fears," he said simply. "But you have no idea what you've brought into your home." The words hung in the air, heavy with warning, leaving a silence that pressed against the walls of the cabin. Leora felt a chill, the kind that reaches deep, the kind that whispers that the night is only the beginning. The man's presence was more than a mystery. It was a catalyst, a force that had turned her quiet life into a landscape of tension, threat, and possibility. Outside, the wind carried hints of movement again, closer now, almost imperceptible. Eyes unseen tracked the cabin, measuring, waiting, patient, and in that still, tense night, Leora understood the truth of what she had done. She had saved a man, but she had also invited history, danger, and a storm that would not be contained. The plains held secrets, the shadows carried whispers, and the man beside her held a past that would not remain silent. Tomorrow, and the days beyond, would bring choices, confrontations, and challenges that would test her courage to its limits. But for now, all she could do was wait. To stand between her daughters and the storm, to face the unknown with the strength she had cultivated in years of loss and survival. The fire flickered low, shadows stretching long and strange across the cabin walls. Leora drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was to come pressing in from every direction. She did not yet know the full measure of the danger, the depths of the mystery, or the legacy of the man she had saved. But she knew, with a certainty that both frightened and steadied her, that nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the night waited, patient and unyielding, carrying whispers of the conflict to come, leaving every heart in the cabin poised on the edge of revelation and peril. The night pressed heavy over the cabin. Shadows stretched long and restless against the walls, and the air seemed to hum with quiet menace. Leora could hear the wind whispering through the trees, carrying hints of movement from beyond the ridge. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves set her nerves taut. Her daughters huddled close beneath the quilt, unaware of the danger, but trusting her instinctively. She tightened her grip on the blanket around them, willing herself to remain calm. The man, whose presence had already changed everything in her life, sat near the fire, his dark eyes scanning the night with a focus that unnerved even her. Though he had been wounded, every small movement betrayed the precision of a trained fighter. Leora had sensed from the start that he carried more than scars. He carried the weight of battles fought and enemies never forgiven. "They're close," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Closer than you think," Leora's mind raced. She had already imagined every scenario: bandits, soldiers, rival hunters, but the stillness beyond the cabin felt as dangerous as any attack. She knew that the plains and ridges were alive with eyes, watching, waiting, and she realized that the man's past had followed him to her doorstep. She had saved him, yes, but in doing so, she had drawn a line between safety and peril. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound of hoofbeats and low whispers, and the man stiffened. "They think I will be careless," he muttered. "They do not know the land like I do, and they will not expect what comes next." Leora's heart thudded in her chest. She wanted to ask what he meant, but instinct told her to listen, to wait, to watch the tension tighten like a coiled spring. Her daughters stirred, sensing the weight of the night, and she reassured them with a quiet voice, though her mind was spinning. The man shifted, leaning closer to the door, listening intently. "They are skilled," he said finally, "and ruthless. If they find a way in, there will be no mercy." Leora swallowed hard. She had lived through loss, through hardship and isolation, but this was different. This was a storm that had arrived with a living, breathing force of danger. Hours passed with every creak and shadow amplified by fear. Leora moved quietly, checking the doors and windows, making sure her daughters were safe, and stealing glances at the man whose every glance seemed to measure the world. He was patient, disciplined, and calm, yet the tension radiating from him made the air taut. She realized that he had fought for survival countless times, and that those skills were now intertwined with her own fight to protect her home. Then, from the ridge, a distant shout cut through the night. Leora froze, recognizing in that sound the deliberate nature of its intent. It was a warning, a challenge, a herald of danger closing in. The man's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. "They have found us," he said simply. "Now the test begins." Leora's pulse quickened. She had no weapons, only the instinct to protect her daughters and the fragile fortress of her home. Yet she felt the strange calm of determination settle over her. She would face whatever came. The first movement was subtle, a shadow crossing the far edge of the trees, a rustle in the underbrush. The man shifted, standing with careful precision, his every motion economical and sharp. Leora noticed the way his body tensed, coiled like a spring, ready to strike. She had never seen anyone move like that, alert, focused, and completely aware of danger, even in silence. "Stay inside," he whispered, eyes locked on the approaching shadows. "Do not make a sound." The minutes stretched long, every heartbeat amplified, every sound magnified. Leora held her daughters close, whispering encouragement, keeping them grounded even as the tension outside grew unbearable. The man had moved to the window, peering through the slats, analyzing the movements of the unseen forces beyond. His expression was unreadable, but Leora could sense the storm gathering in him. The force of survival and strategy that had made him both feared and respected. A sudden snap of a branch echoed from the ridge, and the man reacted instantly, disappearing from the window as if he had melted into the shadows. Leora's heart leaped into her throat. The threat was close now, tangible, pressing in against the cabin, as though the land itself had come alive with danger. She held her breath, counting silently, praying that the skill and knowledge of the man she had saved would be enough to protect them. Footsteps grew louder, deliberate and coordinated. Leora's mind raced through every story she had ever heard. Every warning passed down through generations, and she understood the gravity of the moment. These were not ordinary hunters or wanderers. They were skilled, calculating, and patient. And the man beside her, he was ready. The cabin door rattled once, then twice, the sound sharp in the tense night. Leora froze, gripping her daughters tightly, and the man appeared, standing between them and the door. His eyes like dark steel. "Remember what I taught you," he said quietly, his voice calm yet filled with authority. Leora nodded, though she had never been taught anything beyond survival. She realized now that the lesson was simple: courage, quick thinking, and trust in one another. Another shadow moved near the back of the cabin. The man shifted silently, disappearing from sight as if becoming one with the night itself. Leora could hear the low murmur of voices outside, cautious but intent, probing for weakness. She held her breath, realizing that every decision, every sound, could tip the balance between life and death. She had saved this man, but now he would save her and her daughters from a danger she could not yet see fully. The tension escalated further as the shadows outside pressed closer. The man's movements were swift, decisive, yet controlled, a dance of anticipation and precision. Leora felt a mixture of awe and fear. He was the most feared Apache in the territory, and yet here, in her home, he was vulnerable in the only way that mattered, dedicated to protecting those who had shown him kindness. Suddenly, a cry split the night from the ridge, sharp and commanding. The man's head snapped toward the sound, eyes blazing. "They are divided," he muttered, recognizing the strategy in their approach. Leora felt a chill run through her spine. The tension was at its peak. Every second counted, every movement mattered. The threat was no longer distant. It was here, pressing in from every side. And yet the man's presence gave her a fragile sense of hope. Her daughters stirred slightly, and Leora whispered their names softly, reminding them to remain calm, to stay quiet. She glanced at the man, noticing a subtle shift in his expression, a mixture of warning and reassurance. He was preparing for the moment when all patience and skill would collide with danger. Leora understood that the night was about to erupt into chaos, that the forces outside would meet the readiness inside, and that their survival depended on every instinct, every decision, every ounce of courage they possessed. The fire flickered, shadows dancing wildly across the cabin walls, and Leora felt the air tighten with anticipation. Outside, the wind carried low murmurs, movements, and threats yet unseen. The man shifted again, moving like a shadow, watching, listening, waiting. Leora realized that she had never faced anything like this, that danger had never been so immediate, so real. Yet she felt the strength of her own resolve, the bond forming between her daughters, and the warrior whose life she had saved. The first direct attack came with the crash of a branch against the cabin wall. The man reacted instantly, a blur of motion, and Leora felt the cabin itself tremble under the tension. She gripped her daughters tightly, whispering courage to them, even as the storm pressed closer. The shadows outside moved again, deliberate, relentless. And Leora understood that the climax of the night was near. Every heartbeat echoed with urgency. Every breath carried the weight of survival. The man stood firm, a shield between them and the threat beyond the walls. Leora's own courage burned brighter, a fire ignited by necessity and instinct. The night was poised on a knife's edge, every second a test of skill, trust, and will. The land outside held secrets and threats, yet inside, determination and bond held strong. And as the wind howled, carrying the low murmur of those who hunted them, Leora knew that the climax was approaching, the moment when courage, skill, and loyalty would collide with danger in ways she could not yet predict. Every shadow, every sound, every heartbeat built the suspense, leaving the night heavy with anticipation. The storm was nearly upon them, and yet, in the quiet determination of a mother, her daughters, and a warrior feared by many, there was a fragile hope of promise that they might endure. That courage could stand against fear, and that the dawn, when it came, might yet bring the first light of safety. The first rays of morning broke over the canyon, spilling golden light across the rugged land and washing the cabin in warmth. Leora stirred, pulling her daughters close as the tension of the night slowly eased. The wind that had carried whispers of danger now danced softly through the oaks, gentle and reassuring. The shadows that had pressed at their walls were gone, leaving only the quiet of a world that had survived the night. She glanced at the man who had been their protector. Still seated near the fire, dark eyes thoughtful, face weary but calm, he moved slowly, his muscles stiff from the long night. Yet there was a lightness in his steps that had not been there before. Leora realized, with relief and awe, that he had guided them through the storm, had kept the threat at bay, with skill, courage, and patience. Her daughters stirred, blinking sleep from their eyes, and the youngest reached for his hand without hesitation. Sensing safety in the presence of someone who had braved the darkness for them, the man allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. "You all held your courage," he said quietly, voice low but filled with warmth. "That mattered more than you know," Leora nodded, her own shoulders finally relaxing, realizing that she had stood firm not just for her daughters, but for the man who had become part of their story. In the quiet morning, there was a fragile peace, a moment to catch their breath and acknowledge that they had survived what had seemed impossible. Outside, the plains seemed alive with calm, the danger of the night reduced to echoes and memories. Leora stepped to the door, breathing in the crisp air, feeling it fill her lungs with hope. The world beyond the cabin was still vast and wild, but it was no longer threatening. The man joined her, steady and quiet, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much, yet now reflected something softer, sense of gratitude, of trust earned and returned. "Who are you, really?" Leora asked, voice gentle, curiosity and care woven together. The man's gaze met hers, steady and deep. "I am someone who has walked through fire," he said finally, "and lived to see mercy where it was rare. I am a guardian now, in the way that matters most." Leora felt a shiver of understanding. The battles he had fought, the lives he had touched, and the danger he had endured had led him here to them. and for the first time, the fear that had pressed so heavily against their walls was replaced by trust, by connection, by hope. Her daughters laughed softly, the sound like sunlight breaking through clouds, and the man knelt beside them, showing them how to move quietly and safely, how to listen to the land around them without fear. It was a teaching born not of threat, but of respect. And Leora saw how her daughters' faces lit with wonder as they absorbed his wisdom. In that moment, she realized that this night, terrifying and tense as it had been, had also given them lessons in courage, patience, and the power of compassion. The cabin, once a refuge against an unseen storm, now felt like a home reborn. Leora moved among them, preparing breakfast, sharing quiet smiles, and listening as the man described the land in ways that were new and fascinating. He spoke of the desert winds, the whispering canyons, and the hidden paths that only someone who had survived countless battles could know. Her daughters listened, wide-eyed, as though the world itself had expanded in the space of a single night. Later, the man helped Leora tend to the small garden, showing her ways to fortify their home against both nature and the unpredictability of the world. Leora noticed the care in his hands, the precision in his movements, and she felt a profound respect for the life he had led and the courage he had shown. Every step, every word, every glance carried the weight of experience. Yet it was tempered with a sense of honor and a desire to protect those who had acted with kindness. The afternoon sun warmed the cabin, and the threat that had pressed so closely against them now seemed like a distant memory. Leora and her daughters moved about with confidence, their hearts lighter than they had been for months. She realized that the night's danger had forged something in them, all a deeper connection, a resilience that would guide them through the years to come. The man, once a stranger, had become part of their lives in ways that could not be undone. And in the quiet moments of shared meals and stories, there was a bond that promised protection, trust, and friendship. As evening fell again, calm and golden, Leora and her daughters watched the man settle near the fire, tending quietly to his own injuries and sharing insights about the world beyond the canyon. "The road is long," he said, voice gentle but firm, "and danger will always exist. But courage, kindness, and wisdom can turn fear into strength." "You have shown all three tonight." Leora felt a quiet swell of pride and relief. She had saved a life, yes, but she had also preserved her own courage, her daughter's innocence, and the fragile harmony of their home. The wind whispered through the trees once more, carrying scents of sage and earth, and the man looked toward the horizon, contemplative. "The night has passed," he said softly. "The lessons remain. And sometimes, survival means more than living. It means protecting, teaching, and standing together when the world presses hard against you." Leora nodded, understanding in a way that only experience could teach. She had learned that courage was not always loud, that strength could be quiet, and that even in the face of fear, humanity and compassion could triumph. Her daughters ran to her side, laughing and talking about the night as though it had been an adventure, and she smiled, letting the warmth of the moment fill her heart. The man joined them, sitting quietly and allowing the connection to grow naturally, a guardian, a teacher, and a friend. In that shared space, the tension that had defined the night melted into hope, into the promise of days that could be faced together as darkness approached once more. Calm and serene this time, the cabin glowed with firelight and laughter, the world outside seeming vast but no longer threatening. Leora reflected on the events that had brought them here, the wounded man, the storm of the night, and the choices she had made. She realized that courage, trust, and the willingness to act with compassion could change lives in ways beyond understanding. The man, once a figure of fear and mystery, had become a living reminder of the strength found in courage and the bonds formed in unlikely moments. Finally, as they gathered near the fire, Leora spoke softly, her voice steady and warm. "We have survived, yes, but we have also learned, and tomorrow we will move forward together, stronger than we were yesterday." Her daughters nodded, eyes shining with trust and admiration. and the man offered a rare, genuine smile, one that spoke of respect, gratitude, and the quiet promise of safety. Outside, the plains stretched wide and open, bathed in the soft glow of the rising moon. The wind carried the quiet songs of the night, of life persisting and hope renewed. Leora understood that danger would always exist. The world was wild and unpredictable, but that the bonds forged in courage, trust, and compassion could withstand even the harshest storms. She felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also the lightness of victory. Victory not of violence, but of resilience, love, and the quiet triumph of human connection. The man, once an unknown figure feared across the territory, had become part of their lives, not by force, but by the shared experience of survival, trust, and the courage to act when it mattered most. Leora realized that life could be full of unexpected storms, but it could also bring extraordinary allies, lessons, and moments of joy in the most unlikely ways. Her daughters laughed again, a sound as pure as the desert wind, and the man nodded, quietly acknowledging that the night's trials had formed a bond that would endure as the fire dwindled. Shadows merging with the calm of the night, Leora felt a sense of closure, of relief, and of hope. The world outside remained wild and untamed, but inside their home had become a haven of courage, resilience, and connection. She knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, yet she faced it with strength drawn from experience, wisdom, and the love of her daughters. The man beside her, once a mystery and a storm, had become a guardian, a teacher, and a friend, showing that even the most feared can be tempered by trust and compassion. And as the night finally settled into a gentle, quiet rhythm, Leora understood the most important lesson of all, that courage, kindness, and trust could shape destinies. That danger could be met with determination, and that hope could flourish even in the most unlikely places. Together they had survived the storm, faced the fear, and discovered that the heart's strength could outshine the darkness, leaving them poised to face tomorrow with courage, unity, and the quiet joy of life renewed. The cabin glowed faintly, the firelight reflecting in the man's eyes and the daughter's laughter, a symbol of safety and hope. Outside, the wind carried whispers of a world that had been tested and survived, and Leora knew that the choices made in the quiet of one night would resonate far beyond the canyon walls. They had endured, they had learned, and together they would continue stronger, wiser, and connected in ways that could never be undone.